Hi, this is Laurie King. I'm going to be reading you today a short story called Mrs. Hudson's Case. It was written in 1997, and it's the first introduction that we have to Mrs. Hudson's other side, the one that doesn't just bring cups of tea and shake her head over the antics of her employer, Sherlock Holmes. Mrs. Hudson then went on to star in The Murder of Mary Russell, a book a couple of years ago. And she is also central in 2020's Riviera Gold. Mrs. Hudson's Case by Laurie R. King, me, or rather her, since it was 1997. As has been noted by a previous biographer, Mrs. Hudson was the most long-suffering of landladies. In the years when Sherlock Holmes lived beneath her Baker Street roof, she faced with equanimity his irregular hours, his ill temper, his malodorous and occasionally dangerous chemical experiment, his, again, occasionally malodorous and even dangerous visitors, and all the other demands made on her dwelling and her person. And yet, far from rejoicing when Holmes quit London for the sea-blown expanses of the Sussex Downs, in less than 3 months she had turned her house over to an estate agent and followed him, to run his household as she had formerly run her own. When once I dared to ask her why, late on a celebratory evening when she had rather more drink taken than was her wont, she answered that the devil himself needed someone to look after him, and it made her fingers itch to know that Mr. Holmes was not getting the care to which he was accustomed. Besides, she added under her breath, the new tenants had not been in place for a week before she knew she would go mad with boredom. Thus, thanks to the willingness of this good woman to continue suffering in the service of genius, Holmes's life went on much as before. Not that he was grateful or indeed aware of her sacrifice. He went on, as I said, much as before, feeling vexed when her tidying had removed some vital item, or when her regular market-day absence meant that he had to brew his own coffee. Deep in his misogynistic soul, he was not really convinced that women had minds, rights, or lives of their own. This may be unfair. He was certainly always more than ready to dismiss members of his own sex. However, there is no doubt that a woman, be she lady or governess, triggered in him an automatic response of polite disinterest coupled with vague impatience. It took a high degree of determination on the part of a prospective client who happened to be female to drag him into a case. Mrs. Hudson, though, was nothing if not determined. On this day, in October of 1918, she had pursued him through the house and up the stairs, finally bearding him in his laboratory, where she continued to press upon him the details of her odd experience. However, her bristling Scots implacability made little headway against the carapace of English phlegm that he was turning against her. I stood in the doorway, witness to the meeting of irresistible force and immovable object. No, Mrs. Hudson, absolutely not. I am busy. To prove it, although when I had arrived at his house 20 minutes earlier, I had found him moping over the newspapers, he turned to his acid-stained workbench and reached for some beakers and a couple of long glass tubes. All I'm asking you to do is rig a wee trap, she said, her accent growing with her perturbation. Holmes snorted. A bear trap in the kitchen, perhaps? Oh, a capital idea, Mrs. Hudson. You're not listening to me, Mr. Holmes. I told you I wanted you to fix up a simple camera, so I can see who it is that's been coming in of nights and helping himself to my bits and pieces. Mice, Mrs. Hudson. The country is full of them. He dropped a pipette into a jar and transferred a quantity of liquid into a clean beaker. Mice? She was shocked. In my kitchen? Mr. Holmes, really? Holmes had gone too far and knew it. I do apologize, Mrs. Hudson. Perhaps it was the cat? And what call would a cat have for a needle and thread? She demanded, unplacated. Even if the beastie could work the latch on my sewing case. Perhaps, Russell? You know full well that Mary's been away at university these 4 weeks and just returned. Oh, very well. Ask Will to change the locks on the doors. He turned his back with an optimistic attempt at finality. I don't want the locks changed. I want to know who it is. Things have gone missing from all the neighbors, little things mostly, but it's not nice. I had been watching Holmes's movements, at first idly, then more closely, and now I took a step into the room and caught at Mrs. Hudson's sleeve. Mrs. Hudson, I'll help you with it. I'm sure I can figure out how to booby-trap a camera with a flash. Come on, let's go downstairs and decide where to put it. But I thought, come with me, Mrs. Hudson. Mary, are you certain? Now, Mrs. Hudson. I tightened my grip on her substantial arm and hauled, just as Holmes removed his finger from the end of the pipette and allowed the substance it held to drop into the already seething mixture in the beaker. He had not been paying attention to his experiment. A cloud of noxious green gas began instantly to billow up from the mouth of the beaker. Mrs. Hudson and I went with all haste down the stairs, leaving Holmes to grope his way to the shutters and fling them open, coughing and cursing furiously. Once in our kitchen, Mrs. Hudson's inborn hospitality reasserted itself, and I had to wait until she had stirred up a batch of rock cakes and questioned me about my progress and my diet up at Oxford, in this, my second year there. She then put on the kettle, washed up the bowls, and swept the floor before finally settling in a chair across the soft, scrubbed wood table from me. You were saying, I began, that you've had a series of break-ins and small thefts. Some food and a bit of milk from time to time, usually stale things, a heel of bread, a knob of dry cheese. Some woolen stockings from the darning basket, 2 old blankets I'd intended for the church, and as I said, a couple of needles and a spool of black thread from the sewing case. She nodded at the neat piece of wooden joinery with a padded top that sat in front of her chair by the fire. And I had to agree, no cat could have worked its latch. Alcohol? Never. And never have I missed any of the household money I keep in the tea caddy, or anything of value. Mrs. Prinnings down the road claims she lost a ring to the thief, but she's terribly absent-minded, she is. How is he getting in? I think he must have a key. Seeing my expression, she hastened to explain. There's always one on the hook at the back door. One day last week when Will needed it, I couldn't find it. I thought he'd maybe borrowed it earlier and forgot to return it. That has happened before. But it could have been the thief. And I admit, I'm not always good at locking up all the windows at night, which is probably how he got in the first place. So change the locks? The thing is, Mary, I can't help but feel it's some poor soul who's in need. And although I certainly don't want him to waltz in and out, I do want to know who it is so that I know what to do. Do you follow me? I did, actually. There were a handful of ex-soldiers living around the fringes of Oxford, so badly shell-shocked as to be incapable of ordinary social intercourse, who slept rough and survived by what wits were left them. Tragic figures, and one would not wish to be responsible for their starvation. How many people in the area have been broken into? Pretty near everyone when it first started at the end of September. Since then, those who have locks use them. The others seem to think it's fairies or absent-mindedness. Fairies. The little people are a curious lot, she said. I looked closely to be sure she was joking, but I couldn't tell. Some invisible signal made her rise and go to the oven, and sure enough, the cakes were perfect and golden brown. We ate them with fresh butter and drank tea. Mrs. Hudson carried a tray upstairs and returned without comment but with watering eyes. And then turned our combined intellects to the problem of photographing intruders. I returned the next morning, Saturday, with a variety of equipment, borrowing a hammer, nails, and scraps of wood from old Will, the handyman, and a length of fine fishing twine from his grandson. By trial and error, Mrs. Hudson and I, interrupted regularly by delivery boys, shouts from upstairs, and telephone calls, succeeded in rigging a tripwire across the kitchen door. During the final stages of this delicate operation, as I perched on the stepladder adjusting the camera, I was peripherally aware of Holmes's voice, raised to shout down the telephone in the library. After a few minutes, silence fell, and shortly thereafter his head appeared at the level of my waist. He didn't sneer at my efforts. He acted as if I were not there, as if he had found Mrs. Hudson rolling out a pie crust rather than holding out a selection of wedges for me to use in my adjustments. Mrs. Hudson, it appears that I shall be away for a few days. Would you sort me out some clean collars and the like? Now, Mr. Holmes? Any time in the next 10 minutes will be fine, he said generously, then turned and left without so much as a glance at me. I bent down to call through the doorway at his retreating back. I go back to Oxford tomorrow, Holmes. Good of you to come by, Russell, he said, and disappeared up the stairs. You can leave the wedges with me, Mrs. Hudson, I told her. I'm nearly finished. I could see her waver with the contemplation of rebellion, but we both knew full well that Holmes would leave in 10 minutes, clean linen or no, and whereas I would have happily sent him on his way grubby, Mrs. Hudson's professional pride was at stake. She put the wedges on the top of the stepladder and hurried off. She and Holmes arrived simultaneously in the central room of the old cottage, just as I had alighted from the ladder to examine my handiwork. I turned my gaze to Holmes and found him dressed for town, pulling on a pair of black leather gloves. A case, Holmes? Merely a consultation at this point. Scotland Yard has been reflecting on our success with the Jessica Simpson kidnapping, and in their efforts to trawl the bottom of this latest kidnapping have decided to have me review their efforts for possible gaps. Paperwork merely, Russell, he added. Nothing to excite you. This is the Oberdorfer case? I asked. It was nearly a month since the two children, 12-year-old Sarah and her 7-year-old brother Louis, had vanished from Hyde Park under the expensive nose of their nurse. They were orphans, the children of a cloth manufacturer with factories in 3 countries and his independently wealthy French wife. His brother, who had taken refuge in London during the war, had anticipated a huge demand of ransom. He was still waiting. Is there news? There is nothing. No ransom note, no sightings, nothing. Scotland Yard is settling to the opinion that it was an outburst of anti-German sentiment that went too far, along the lines of smashing of German shopkeepers' windows that were so common in the opening months of the war. Lestrade believes the kidnapping was a rank amateur who panicked at his own audacity and killed them, and further thinks their body will be found any day, no doubt, by some sportsman's dog. He grimaced, tucked in the ends of his scarf, buttoned his coat against the cool autumnal day, and took the portmanteau from Mrs. Hudson's hand. Well, good luck, Holmes, I said. Luck, he said austerely, has nothing to do with it. When he had left, Mrs. Hudson and I stood looking at each other for a long minute, sobered by this reminder of what was almost certainly foul murder, and also by the revealing lack of enthusiasm and optimism in the demeanor of the man who had just driven off. Whatever he might say, our success in the Simpson case 2 months earlier had been guided by luck, and I had no yearning to join forces in a second kidnap case, particularly one that was patently hopeless. I sighed, and then returned to my trap. I explained how the camera worked and told her where to take the film to be developed, and then tidied away my tools and prepared to take my own departure. You'll let me know if anything turns up, I asked. I could try to make it back down next weekend, but no, Mary. You mustn't interfere with your studies. I shall write and let you know. I stepped cautiously over the top fishing wire and paused in the doorway. And you'll tell me if Holmes seems to need any assistance in this Oberdorfer case. That I will. I left, ruefully contemplating the irony of a man who normally avoided children like the plague, aside from those miniature adults he had scraped off the streets to form his irregulars in the Baker Street days. These days he seemed to have his hands full of them. I returned to Oxford and my studies, and truth to tell, the first thought I had about Mrs. Hudson's problem was more than a week later, on a Wednesday, when I realized that for the second week in a row, her inevitable Tuesday letter had not come. I had not expected the first one, although she often wrote even if I had seen her the day before, but Not to write after 8 days was unprecedented. I telephoned the cottage that evening. Holmes was still away, interviewing the Oberdorfer uncle, Mrs. Hudson thought. She herself sounded most peculiar, distracted, and said merely that she'd been too busy to write, apologized, and asked if there was anything in particular I was wanting. Badly taken aback, I stammered out a question concerning our camera trap. Oh, yes, she said, the camera. No, nothing much has come of that. Still, it was a good idea, Mary, thank you. Well, I must be gone now, dear. Take care. The line went dead, and I slowly put up the earpiece. She hadn't even asked if I was eating well. I was hit by a sudden absurd desire to leave immediately for Sussex. I succeeded in pushing it away, but on Saturday morning I was on the train south, and by Saturday afternoon my hand was on the kitchen door to Holmes's cottage. A moment later my nose was nearly on the door as well, flattened against it, in fact, because the door did not open. It was locked. This door was never locked. Certainly not in the daytime when there was anyone at home, yet I could have sworn that I heard a scurry of sound from within. When I tried to look in the window, my eyes were met by a gaily patterned tea towel pinned up neatly to all the edges. "Mrs. Hudson?" I called. No answer. Perhaps the movement had been the cat. I went around the house, tried the French doors, found them locked as well, and continued around to the front door, only to have it open as I stretched out my hand. Mrs. Hudson stood in the narrow opening, her sturdy shoe planted firmly against the door's lower edge. "Mrs. Hudson, there you are. I was beginning to think you'd gone out." "Hello there, Mary. I'm surprised to see you back down here so soon. Mr. Holmes isn't back from the continent yet. Sorry." "Actually, I came to see you." "Ah, Mary, such a pity, but I really can't have you in. I'm taking advantage of Mr. Holmes's absence to turn out the house, and things are in a dreadful state. You should have checked with me first, dear." A brief glance at her tidy, uncovered hair and her clean hand on the door made it obvious that heavy house cleaning was not her current preoccupation. Yet she did not appear afraid, as if she was being held hostage or something. She seemed merely determined. Still, I had to keep her at the door as long as I could while I searched for a clue to her odd behavior. Such was my intention, however. Every question was met by a slight edging back into the house and an increment of closure of the door, until eventually it clicked shut before me. I heard the sound of the bolt being shot, and then Mrs. Hudson's firm footsteps retreating toward the kitchen. I stood away from the house, frankly astonished. I couldn't even peer in, as the sitting room windows overlooking the kitchen had had their curtains tightly shut. I considered and discarded a full frontal assault, and decided that the only thing for it was stealth. Mrs. Hudson knew me well enough to expect it of me. Of that I was fully aware. So I took care to stay away that evening, even ringing her from my own house several miles away to let her know that I was not outside the cottage watching her curtains. She also knew that I had to take the Sunday night train in order to be at the Monday morning lectures, and would then begin to relax. Sunday night, therefore, was when I took up my position outside the kitchen window. For a long time all I heard was busy kitchen sounds, a knife on a cutting board, a spoon scraping against the side of a pot, the clatter of a bowl going into the stone sink. Then, without warning, at about 9 o'clock, Mrs. Hudson spoke. "Hello there, dear. Have a good sleep." "I always feel I should say good morning, but it's night time," said a voice in response, and I was so startled I nearly knocked over a pot of herbs. The voice was that of a child, sleep-clogged but high-pitched, a child with a very faint German accent. Enough of this, I thought. I was tempted to heave the herb pot through the window and just clamber in, but I was not sure of the condition of Mrs. Hudson's heart. Instead, I went silently around the house, found the door barred to my key, and ended up retrieving the long ladder from the side of the garden shed and propping it against Holmes's window. Of course, the man would have jimmy-proof latches. Finally, in frustration, I used a rock. And fast as Mrs. Hudson was in responding to the sound of breaking glass, I still met her at the foot of the stairs and slipped past her by feinting to the left and ducking past her on the right. The kitchen was bare. However, the bolt was still shut, so the owner of the German voice was here somewhere. I ignored the furious Scotswoman at my back and ran my eyes over the scene. The pots of food that she would not have cooked for herself alone. The table laid for three, one of the place settings with a diminutive fork, and a china mug decorated with pigs wearing toppers and tails, and two new hairbrushes lying on a towel on the side of the sink. "Tell them to come out," I said. She sighed deeply. "You don't know what you're doing, Mary." "Of course I don't. How can I know anything if you keep me in the dark?" "Oh, very well. I should have known you'd persist until you found out. I was going to move them, but—" She paused and raised her voice. "Sarah, Louis, come out here." They came, not as I had expected from the pantry, but crawling out of the tiny cupboard in the corner. When they were standing in the room, eyeing me warily, Mrs. Hudson made the introductions. "Sarah and Louis Oberdorfer, Miss Mary Russell. Don't worry, she's a friend, a very nosy friend." She sniffed and turned to take another place setting from the sideboard and lay it out, at the far end of the table, from the three places already there. "The Oberdorfers," I said. "How on earth did they get here? Did Holmes bring them? Don't you know that the police in 2 countries are looking for them?" 12-year-old Sarah glowered at me. Her 7-year-old brother edged behind her fearfully. Mrs. Hudson set the kettle down forcefully on the hob. "Of course I do. And no, Mr. Holmes is not aware that they are here." "But he's actually working on the case. How could you—" She cut me off. Chin raised, gray hair quivering, she turned on me with a porridge spoon in her hand. "Now don't you go accusing me of being a traitor, Mary Russell. Not until you know what I know." We faced off across the kitchen table, the stout, aging Scots housekeeper and the lanky Oxford undergraduate, until I realized simultaneously that whatever she was cooking smelt superb, and that perhaps I ought indeed to know what she knew. A truce was called, and we sat down at the table to break bread together. It took a long time for the various threads of the story to trickle out, narrated by Mrs. Hudson telling how, in Holmes's absence, she could nap in the afternoons so as to sit up night after night until the door had finally been opened by the thief, and by Sarah Oberdorfer, who coolly recited how she had schemed and prepared with map and warm clothes and enough money to get them started, and only seemed troubled at the telling of how she had been forced to take to a life of crime. With the occasional contribution by young Louis, who thought the whole thing a great lark, from the adventure of hiding among the baggage in the train from London to the thrill of wandering the downs unsupervised in the moonlight. It took longer still for the entire thing to become clear in my mind, until midnight, in fact, when the 2 children, who had from the beginning been sleeping days and active at night to help prevent discovery, were stretched out on the carpet in front of the fire in the next room, coloring pictures. "Just to make sure I have all this straight," I said to Mrs. Hudson, feeling rather tired. "Let me go over it again. First, they say they were not kidnapped. They fled, under their own power, from their uncle James Oberdorfer because they believed he was trying to kill them in order to inherit his late brother's, their father's, property. You can see Sarah believes it." I sighed. "Oh, yes, I admit she does. Nobody would run away from a comfortable house, hide in a baggage car, and live in a cave for 3 weeks on stolen food if she didn't believe it. And yes, I admit that there seems to have been a very odd series of accidents. Mrs. Hudson's own investigative machinery, though not as smooth as that of her employer, was both robust and labyrinthine. She had found out through the servant sister of another landlady who had a friend who, and so forth. There was a great deal of money involved. with factories not only here and in France, but also in Germany, where the war seemed on the verge of coming to its bloody end. These were two very wealthy orphans, their only family left, the one uncle. An uncle who, according to the below-the-stairs rumor collected by Mrs. Hudson's network of informants, exhibited a smarmy, shallow affection to his charges. I put my head into my hands. It all rested on Sarah. A different child I might have dismissed as being prone to imaginative stories, but those steady brown eyes of hers daring me to disbelieve. I could see why Mrs. Hudson, by no means an easy mark for a sad story, had taken them under her wing. And you say the footman witnessed the near drowning, I said, without looking up. If he hadn't happened upon them, they'd have been lost, he said. And the maid who ate some of the special pudding their uncle brought them was indeed very ill. But there's no proof. No. She wasn't making this any easier for me. We both knew that Holmes, with his attitudes toward children, and particularly girl children, would hand these two back to their uncle. Oh, he would issue the man a stern warning that he, Holmes, would in the future take a close personal interest in the safety of the Oberdorfer heirs. But, after all, accidents were unpredictable things, and particularly if Oberdorfer chose to return to the chaos of war-ravaged Germany. If he decided the inheritance was worth the risk, and took care that no proof was available. No proof here either, one way or the other. And this was one case I could not discuss with Holmes. And you were planning on sending them to your cousin in Wiltshire? It's a nice, healthy farm near a good school, and who would question two more children orphaned by Zeppelin bombs? But only until Sarah is 16. 3 years and a bit. She'd be a young lady then, not legally, of course, but lawyers would listen to her. I was only 18 myself, and could well believe that authorities who would dismiss a 12-year-old's wild accusations would prick their ears at a self-contained 16-year-old. Why, even Holmes. All right, Mrs. Hudson, you win. I'll help you get them to Wiltshire. I was not there when Holmes returned a week later, drained and irritable at his failure to enlighten Scotland Yard. Mrs. Hudson said nothing, just served him his dinner and his newspapers and went about her business. She said nothing then, and she said nothing later that evening when Holmes, who had carried his collection of papers to the basket chair in front of the fire and prepared to settle in, leapt wildly to his feet, bent over to dig among the cushions for a moment, then turned in accusation to his housekeeper with the gnawed stub of a colored pencil in his outstretched palm. She said she never did say anything. Not even 3 years later, when the young heir and his older sister, her hair piled carefully on top of her head, wearing a grown woman's hat and a dress a bit too old for her slim young frame, miraculously materialized in a solicitor's office in London, creating a stir in 3 countries. However, several times over the years, whenever Holmes was making some particularly irksome demand on her patience, I saw this most long-suffering of landladies take a deep breath, focus on something far away, and nod briefly before going on her placid way, with a tiny, satisfied smile on her face. Mrs. Hudson's case.